Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kat Lloyd with the Tenement Museum's Education Department. I'm thrilled to be joined tonight by Sara Jensen Carr, author of Topography of Wellness, as well as an assistant professor of architecture and the program director for the Master of Design in Sustainable Urban Environments at Northeastern University, for a conversation on Topography of Wellness, her latest book. So tonight's book is available through the Tenement Museum shop at the link in the chat. And we definitely want to hear from you in the chat as well. So please share your connections and questions for us, and we'll make sure to get to as many as we can tonight. So Sara, I was really just so struck in reading your book, just how much of your research and the topics covered in Topography of Wellness connect to what we do at the Tenement Museum. Our tenement buildings were both built in the 19th century and were homes really through the turn of the century and into the 20th. And your research really covers that same trajectory of our tenement buildings. And we often talk about on our tours where we're sharing stories of families who lived in these buildings. We share how public health concerns were impacting the design of tenements, how tenements like 97 and 103 Orchard Street changed over time because of concerns about health. And we've really spent the last 2 years then reflecting how the same questions that were being asked 100 and 150 years ago about safe and healthy spaces are the questions that we are grappling with today in our current moment. So, it was really, there's so much alignment between the topics covered in this book and our work at the museum. And I'd really like to start with the beginning, right, of within this research. Where did you sort of identify the beginning of urban planning's consideration of health? So where did people start to care about the health of people in cities, and where can we see the impact of some of these early connections?
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be giving a talk for the Tenement Museum because, as you said, so many of these ideas relate directly to housing. Even though the book is maybe more so about the urban landscape, but I think that just has to be taken in mind. And I also want to thank you for the opportunity to share some of the images from the book tonight, which I will actually do right now. Okay. Do you see that okay there?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, I'm just going to stop. I mean, although the book starts with urban history, and I'll get there in a second, I mean, of course, there are lots of examples of early civilizations taking into account built environment and health outcomes. Lots of people cite, up through the 20th century, Hippocrates' Airs, Waters, Places, which is written in 400 BC, where he talks about sort of the placement of settlements and the importance of good airs and waters to health. Ancient Greeks put healing temples by the water. Of course, the Romans had aqueduct systems that were elevated to keep the water clean as well. And so I think, these concerns about how we build our settlements and where we live and are very much connected in a long arc of history. In the book, I really try and start with the beginning of Western urban history in both London and New York before we shift permanently to the American landscape. And, if you think about where these concerns came from, it was just sort of the sheer crisis of what was happening in cities at the time. There's lots of people moving in at once, lots of dirty industry, still a lot of agricultural activity in cities as well, and no coordinated waste removal, right? So you had sort of this like ramshackle hybrid of cows running through the streets and dead animals laying and children playing. And so these really virulent and violent outbreaks of what was called filth diseases like yellow fever and cholera struck the population, and there was really no choice but to start to examine the environment. And this is where, Hippocrates' ideas, particularly about this idea of miasma, or that disease traveled through the air, governed a lot of decisions made during this time. Of course, this also coincides with sort of the professionalization of design, of urban planning, and the public health professions too. And so it really presented this opportunity for these professions to come together and think about how to tackle this crisis. And, as we were just talking about before we went live, we still see the effects of this all around us, chiefly in the miles of underground wastewater pipes that were installed in the wake of this. Is a great technological achievement. Just the idea of street sanitation, even though it was through John Snow's cholera maps, people were able to link cholera and yellow fever outbreaks to the ingestion of polluted water. This idea of miasma was so tangible. I mean, if we just think about sort of the filth that existed in cities at the time, that underground waste infrastructure was not just about moving wastewater underneath, but also sort of trapping miasmic airs underneath. And so we see that all around us. It's not just installing the wastewater infrastructure, but if you think about, to accommodate those pipes, streets had to get wider. They had to become straighter to bring the outfall into water bodies. And you can see here, I think this is a great example of how much these changes were sort of heralded in the popular press. So this is Harper's Weekly. These are identical street corners that were 2 years apart. A really interesting sort of revelation that came when I was reading some of the early sanitary surveys is there was actually this there was actually a push to replace a lot of cobblestones in the streets with smooth pavement too, because it was even thought sort of the joints in between cobblestones could hold filthy air in between them and also make people sick. And so, we really see this. And then, of course, also with tenements, right? The changes in the code to require light and air for all the units, which I know, you go over in your in your tours as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You use as one of your sources the sanitation report that was created for New York City in 1865. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
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 And for our building, 97 Orchard Street, the older one was constructed in 1863.
Oh,
So
okay.
it was already open when that sanitation report was conducted. And we were able to find reference to, of course, the neighborhood where 97 Orchard Street is, the 10th ward in that report. And it was actually described as salubrious or more healthy.
Right.
So it was interesting to see, in contrast to other neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan, how the Lower East Side that we know today, at that point, the 10th ward, was actually being described as a better place because of the health conditions. And we know in 97 Orchard Street that there was a connection to the sewer system from the backyard and the outhouses out to the sewer system, which, I think many museum researchers and visitors are surprised at, seeing sort of how this seems a little bit earlier, but it's also so connected to these conversations that were happening in this time period.
Yeah, and it's so modern. And I think, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the end. I'm sure there'll be questions of sort of how is the COVID pandemic going to change architecture? And I think the problem is when you talk about the built environment is it's very slow, right? We won't know for years. And just as it's slow to be adopted in the built environment, I mean, ideas are slow to be adopted too, right? Even though, there's a significant portion of the scientific community that knew that cholera and yellow fever were spread through ingestion. Miasma was such, I think, a tangible thing for people to hold on to when they were occupying the city. And so it just made sense to start to bring light and air into the tenements even before maybe these, these discoveries were made public.
And that's fascinating, right? The sort of course, time that it takes for, ideas to filter down and to impact the built environment. But also, interesting to see how those ideas about airs and miasmas start to shape the metaphors that are then being used to describe cities and the people who live in cities. So in your research, what kind of metaphors about health did you find that some of these early city planners were using to describe their work?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so interesting is that there's this recurring theme of just using bodily metaphors to think about the city too, right? The city as a body, and that this is one of the easiest ways or most direct ways that people could understand urban systems was to link it back to, evidence about the body that was still emerging at this time and emerging about disease itself. So Richard Sennett in Flesh and Stone, he talks about how before some of these ideas came to the United States in 18th and 19th century European cities, began to prioritize circulation and movement more in their street designs in the wake of William Harvey's discoveries about how the heart powered blood circulation. And so any dirt or grime that was left in streets was thought to clog healthy air traveling to different sectors of the city. Public spaces, palaces, places of commerce were thought of hearts, right, that could power that movement through the cities as well. And there was also, actually, interestingly, there was a rise in the use of one-way streets that could maintain this fast movement. And it also, of course, mimics the directionality of veins and arteries. And now keeping in mind, I mean, it was useful. These sort of like remaking of European cities also served other purposes, such as, surveillance and, the clearing out of slums, which were thought to spread disease. So there's a health connection there too, with maybe more nefarious purposes. But these bodily metaphors existed in other places as well. If we look at The Plan of Chicago by Daniel Burnham, we can see the direct links, and he was very upfront about it too, but the inspiration from Haussmann's plans of Paris too, again, where you have these wide streets, that directionality again. Maybe a minimal use of landscape. It's not, even though he talks about the importance of landscape for health, he's maybe not so concerned about this as in sort of the monumentality of cities and the overall city beautiful movement. I think, though, in the American landscape, these metaphors are probably no more convincing than in the movement to build large urban parks, which came after the sort of immediate remaking of the cities. And even after the cholera and yellow fever epidemics, there was still a pretty significant prevalence of respiratory diseases. And so, again, we'll probably talk about this at the end, but it has a lot of relevance to today when we're dealing with another respiratory virus. So Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect of Central Park, Prospect Park, the Emerald Necklace here in Boston, where I live, he actually had a public health background, and he served for some time on the U.S. Sanitary Commission. So I think what makes Olmsted such an important figure in the book, and also when we talk about the applications for today, is he had a real background, a real practical application of these ideas, and he had a real place of expertise. But he also, I think, married it really well with sort of like the poetics of design and the metaphors. It was not just, for direct health reasons, but he also foresaw the use of public parks as a place for social connection, a place that would be essential for democracy, and also, which I think is really forward thinking of him, but also essential for the mental health of urban dwellers. Specifically, he talks about the working class, who were not able to escape the city like many of the elite were for country homes, but still needed a place to access nature, to sort of, escape sort of the relentlessness of the city. That said, although the quote, parks are the lungs of the city, it's often attributed to him incorrectly, but that's actually a term that comes from early newspapers in London. They were talking about parks in London, and he was inspired by a lot of the parks movement in London too. You see columns called The Lungs of London, right? We're talking about the parks movement there. And so not only was this very practical application, but if you look at his plans, what I really love about them is they really do have this biological nature about them. Like you look at this plan of Prospect Park, and it does look like a biophilic design, and the paths look like veins that are sort of like breathing this fresh air in the city. And this idea that you could escape here and sort of travel among the paths, and it would put you in touch with yourself and your own body as well as nature. So there's so many layers, I think, of how he was able to take both practical and poetic applications of landscape design, especially as related to concerns for health.
Mm-hmm. And certainly just the idea of nature as a cure becomes so apparent in looking at the parts of the book on parks and sort of these escapes, both inside and outside of urban environments in the 19th century. And really, too, I wasn't aware before reading this book about Frederick Law Olmsted's background and how his experience with public health so deeply shaped the work that then he was doing in the landscape and building up sort of these spaces that now we come to take so much for granted within our day-to-day in the city.
Yeah.
But just to add to another layer to some of the conversations about parks, and in particular playgrounds. The Lower East Side became home in 1903 to the very first city-run playground. It was opened in Seward Park, and it was kind of a tough sell to get the city to actually take over a playground. So we often share on our walking tour where we stop at this park and playground. We often share sort of that tension around kind of what parks should be for, what happens in parks, who are parks for. But I'm curious, sort of in your research into the parks movement. I mean, what sort of tensions or complications did you find sort of within this movement? Because at face value, and certainly looking back, it can seem so simple to say, yes, of course, parks are the answer. But what else should we know about sort of this movement?
Yeah, I think one thing, we should always discuss to sort of complicate Frederick Law Olmson's legacy is that he was, and I was going to say, in addition to a public health background, he was a journalist as well. And so, I mean, luckily he left, reams of writing for us and sort of advocacy. I think
a historian's dream, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, thank you very much, Frederick Law Olmsted, for helping shape so much of these ideas. But there was, I think this is, quite typical of some of these progressive era ideas that, we should have public infrastructure, right? We need to uplift the working class. That said, like, he had very specific ideas of what was the correct way to use his park. And this is sort of another thread that runs through the book, is this idea of morality and health, right? And the sort of like top down, not policing, but policing sometimes, but the sort of dictation of like what's the proper way to use the park and what is healthy. And so even though he did see these parks as democratic spaces, what was really behind it too is he wanted the working class to mix with the upper class so they could learn how to behave. And he's quite upfront about that. He didn't even want people eating in some of his parks, no picnicking, right? and no political speech. He writes a lot about that, which I think I always think about that when I see Franklin Park here in Boston, which was the site of the largest Black Lives Matter gathering a couple of summers ago now. So even though he had these sort of like strict ideas and a lot of ideas about morality, I think in the end, I mean, he was open to the idea that the cities would change around it, right? And maybe it could accommodate a lot of these plans. I don't know, but I think we do see sort of like the continuing need for these parks and just open space. And I think we also can't ignore, like, to get these large open spaces came at the cost of removing the neighborhoods that were there before. So especially, the history of Seneca Village, which was a thriving African-American neighborhood. We know much more now about its history. And even though Olmsted was not involved directly with that sort of land acquirement, he was he was a part of sort of like casting the idea of Seneca Village and an Irish settlement that was on this land too, as a slum, right? And that it was a place of disease and it needed to be moved for a park because a park was a healthier place to be. And so I think, for all the good these parks did and continue to do, if we're applying any of these ideas in the future, we have to take that in mind as well.
I think that's such an important point. The museum is currently researching a new exhibit that will open within the next year, where we look at the connections and true stories of a Irish immigrant couple and an African-American couple in the 1860s. And of course, Seneca Village is so much a part of that wider context of these stories and how marginalized populations were trying to make spaces for themselves within the city. And Certainly, I mean, within your book, you look at sort of throughout how these ideas about disease and end up being ideas about the people who contract these diseases,
Yeah.
and end up with a lot of these judgments about morality and who the people are who live within these spaces that are experiencing the ill health effects.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And, of course, because your book covers, a wide swath of time, right? You look at the changes in understandings of disease, right? And the emergence of germ theory, contagious disease really falling as a case of mortality for city residents. And sort of trace how the metaphors of health kind of change with those changing theories and understandings of these contagious illnesses. So, how would you sort of describe that relationship? Like, as the metaphors change, the ideas in city planning changes. How were sort of public health and city planning sort of shifting around the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries as these ideas about disease are shifting?
Yeah, so I think, and there's a lot of wonderful histories about urban planning and public health out there, but many of them sort of point to this rise of germ theory, in particular vaccination, of when environmental concerns were divorced from health concerns. I think maybe more so these ideas were really just integrated into design and planning in a different way. Both real and metaphorical as well. And I think what also shifts is the sort of environmental ethic, right? That the built environment is a place where we need to support the health for everybody. And even though this is sort of like always an undercurrent in the history of American public health, but with vaccinations and the idea that disease is maybe conquered at the microbial level, that individuals are responsible for their own health. And I think that's the real turn that we start to see. Both in sort of the disintegration of public health in the United States in general, and this turn towards the medical instead. But we see that, kind of leak over into design and planning as well. To leave the United States for a moment, although this does have relevance to what was built here at the time, the work of Swiss architect Le Corbusier was very concerned with the body, albeit what we see here in Montjour, which is sort of a rethinking of the Vitruvian man, is an ideal body, right? But it's a male body, 6 feet tall, right? So very specific, but he's still using this to dictate ergonomics, the design of furniture, and the design of housing units. But light and air, which were so essential to reshaping cities and reshaping housing in the late 19th and early 20th century, were also integrated in here. But, in modernism, it was really applied to design in a really vaccination-like manner. And so if you read his books, he is dictating how many meters of plate glass there needs to be to let in exactly the right amount of sunlight, the volume of air circulation that needs to be passing through these units, how many acres of green space there need to be per person. And, he doesn't talk about sort of like the planning of it and the design of it. He says it can all be sort of like aggregated on the ground. We know that had a lot of ruinous effects, especially in public housing down the road. And, talking about temperature, the space that would be meted out per person, he talks about housing as cells. And so we see, again, the application of germ theory and this sort of, what I call scientizing architecture and design as well, like trying to give it sort of that important platform. To create communities, he talks about, and the radiant city is a hypothetical proposal, but I think what you see here is density is not the concern that it was in the era of infectious disease because of vaccinations and germ theories, but there's this idea of sterility, right, that we can sort of like overcome any kind of infectious disease, and that those units are just repeated infinitely, right? There's not sort of this overall concern with community, right? Or thinking about sort of the ecosystems of cities. I write quite a bit too about how these metaphors come together to more ruinous ends when we talk about blight and the urban crisis. And so while Blight was, of course, the end result of resources shifting from the city to the suburbs, of highway construction, of white flight, um, it was really fascinating for me, again, looking at these planning documents or looking at the way Blight was written about at the time, the use of medical metaphor, specifically cancer. And this is the era of Blight and the urban crisis really coincides with cancer's rise as the primary cause of mortality in the United States. And I think because we know so much more, we kind of forget about this era where nobody knew where cancer came from. They thought it was a germ, right? To the effect where they were experimenting on monkeys and trying to infect them with a cancer germ to see how it spread. And cancer was terrifying because its forces were unknown. And Susan Sontag writes really poetically about it in Illness as Metaphor. She talks about the shift from tuberculosis to cancer as a main health concern, and how people project sort of just so much fear on it as well. And so in this time where cancer was really, an unknown disease and the forces of blight were unknown as well, this sort of this medical metaphor applied to blight was in its documentation. And so this is a fairly typical blight survey that was done in a lot of cities at the time. And even though this is a mid-sized town, Clinton, North Carolina, but they're mapping blight much like John Snow mapped cholera in London, where they're trying to find a source, right? Trying to find overlaying environmental conditions. But the other part of this too was these blight maps would be published by cities, and they would also attach the occurrence of blight to crime, to juvenile delinquency, venereal disease, in sort of implying the moral rot of the city as well, to its physical rot, and of course enforcing racist perceptions of Black and immigrant neighborhoods. And it was really reinforced in documents like this, where it seems like a sort of contagion, right, that is going to spread to your neighborhood, most specifically the white suburbs, if it's not put under control in some way. And then in very obvious ways like this, and these kind of government documents that talk about slums and blight as a disease of urban life and talk about its contagion and are really warning that if nothing is done, that it's going to spread, and very specifically referred to as a cancer as well. And so, at the time, cancer, the way to treat cancer was, of course, chemotherapy, but also sometimes the total removal of organs. What you see on the right is a film still from The Warning Shadow, which is the slide, a couple slides back as well, where the end result is the man whose lung they're looking at, who has the cancer. It ends with him with suggesting the total removal of the lung, a pneumonectomy, right? And this treatment, the treatment in cities was really akin to the sort of treatment of cancer, the elimination of the germs, in effect, the elimination of entire neighborhoods. And again, these metaphors are just out there. They're very, very obvious. The E.L.L. Sarnon in his book, he's talking about the city, its growth, its decay, its future. He talks very specifically about how when cancer affects an organ, it cannot affect other neighborhoods. In fact, you have to just get rid of it completely. There's no treatment, right, that you can make on the ground. And here he's talking about sort of like the chaos in cities, and rebuilding them in the manner of healthy cells, which you see on the right. This is a little suggestion for the way cities should be rebuilt. And so you can see in a document like this, strikingly similar, again, documents with urban renewal. I mean, I have one from New York. In the book, I talk about another one from San Francisco, where you have these sort of like sterile new buildings. There's this obligatory graft of green, but the idea is to completely eliminate what was there before. And I think what's important to realize too is, like, even though this was a metaphor that was applied to the neighborhood, the results of displacement, and not just urban displacement that came from urban renewal, but also redlining that accompanied these moves, still has very real physiological effects on people that live there today, on their descendants as well. Of course, we've seen a lot of emerging evidence that there's a higher rate of cardiovascular disease, asthma, and diabetes in formerly red line neighborhoods, which are also, more subject to the effects of climate change as well. And so there's really this legacy of continued environmental discrimination and neglect and poor health because of these moves in the mid-century.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, in the, residents of the the Lower East Side, especially ones who live closer to the FDR highway that was built sort of in this 20th century period, we see a lot of the same impacts that you're discussing, and that sort of very clear through line from these ideas about removing and sort of drastically changing these portions of the neighborhood, and then the impact on the people who lived in them then and then live in them today. The other sort of recent case connected to this, the residents of the neighborhood that the Cross Bronx Expressway cuts through, there was a group of residents who recently sued New York City for the sort of legacy of these ill health effects decades and decades later. So very much still with us. But, I think in the book, you sort of point out this really clear contradiction that you see in this of these changing metaphors, is that at the same time, right, we see sort of this focus to the individual and metaphors being used sort of at a more individual level, whether it's cells or, I remember the example of the sort of building that Le Corbusier sort of describes as a body. You also really see this shift to a sense of design without people, right? I'm struck in so many of these images and drawings, just how few people are in some of these images, and how it really seems like there becomes this really big disconnect between planning and who the planning is for, right? And I think we see a lot of that today and in the 20th century in housing, right? And you look at throughout, the book, so many different examples of how we see these changing ideas about cities and about health, how those ideas come to impact changes in housing. So what are a few examples that like everyone should be familiar with to sort of understand some of these changes in housing that you trace?
Yeah. Sorry if you hear a phone in the background and my husband's, I just have to let it go to voice.
We are all in the real world. It is fine.
Yeah. Thank you, Zoom obviously at the Tenement Museum, you go over a lot of these ideas, and I think especially starting, sort of the beginning of housing and how these ideas about health sort of affected the built environment here. And I think we always see the most experimental ideas about health and housing applied to public housing to varying degrees of success. Of course, there's been a lot of sort of real improvements made on that front. I think it's always worth interrogating what that means, from the well-meaning impulse to build healthier places for our most vulnerable, to what kind of moral judgment, though, on the people that it implies, and maybe most of all reckoning with how, at least in the United States, maybe a lot of the failures is just sort of like in the overall maintenance and care of these buildings as well. But I think public housing comes up so much in the book just because sort of it's always been pinned as sort of the locus of disease. And like you said, there's this tension, that dates back to the Industrial Revolution too, about is it the environment or is it a failing of the people itself? And you see arguments, all the time in both ways. So, to bring up Corbusier again, though, because, and I can say here, this is actually a page from the sanitary survey that we talked about that, just outright talks about tenements as a fever nest of the avenues. So again, it's, even though the idea was to improve these tenements, there's that tension as well. And so just bringing up Corbusier again, although he has only one built work in the United States, there's a lot of clear parallels between his ideas on high density housing and how they were applied with maybe less success in many large public housing developments in the mid-century. Although you can see in the design and the shape of these units that they all had light and air. There was also a lot of experiments we see at this time, like skip-stop elevators, exposed parking, a lack of public space, a lot of nooks and crannies, where people could hide in. And most of all, again, just to repeat again, this lack of maintenance, and this really ended up being detrimental to a lot of residents' health. But it was important to me as well to highlight, some of the successful ideas, though, that also came from European housing, European social housing, that were translated into the United States. I think, projects like the Harbor Hills Housing Project, which is still held out as a pretty important piece, and even, Lockfield Garden Public Housing in Indianapolis, Indiana, which I believe has been remade as sort of market rate housing now. But I think what's successful here is this, this idea of this articulation of a real place, and that comes from sort of the detail, the care that's been taken in planning the units and on the facades. I would say, especially the scale comes into it as well. And then to me, as a landscape architect, of course, what's really interesting to me is like that care taken into the communal spaces and the landscape and the access to nature outside. I think, and then maybe this sort of like bring us to present day too, and to talk about how health concerns would change. And, I wanted to note, for people listening today, I actually wrote most of this book pre-pandemic. I actually turned in the finalish draft in February 2020. So I had to wrest it back to kind of redo the introduction and conclusion on COVID, even though we still don't really know, what the effect would be. And so to me, the logical ending of the book was these new ideas about autocentric development, right? And sort of the boogeyman or the epidemic of the late 20th and early 21st century being obesity and this idea of physical activity, with maybe less concentration on it too, about how autocentric development is going to impact climate change, which is of course going to, along with the pandemic, it's going to probably be the chief impact on all of our health. It's fascinating because, again, to bring it back to obesity, we actually see the Surgeon General advocating in 2015 to reshape communities around walkability and active transportation. And so we see those concerns come to public housing again. And, the Congress for New Urbanism had a very strong partnership with the government, especially the Clinton administration's Hope 6 program, to bring their ideas, which again, started with a manifesto against autocentric development, and this idea that we, good ideas, like absolutely, like a lot of our development is too autocentric, and it prevents autonomy. It prevents, it's bad for the climate. It's bad for civic engagement. And ultimately, again, maybe the main failure with Hope 6 was not specifically the design, but probably the administration. But I think it's interesting how we still see the effects of these ideas, sort of, again, that the health ideas about new urbanism trickle down, even to Honolulu, which is where I lived before I moved to Boston, and this sort of, new urbanism form that was grafted on to public housing tenement here. But again, this particular public housing development is still quite separate from the rest of the city. It's a lot of the planning that sort of leaves it in ruin as well, and again, the maintenance. And even here in New Orleans, which I think actually, Harmony Oaks has been more or less a successful development, but we can see, even though a lot of the new urbanism forms were taken from Southern vernacular, it still looks a bit out of place in the city, right? And it still sort of marks it as public housing. And so again, I think public housing has really sort of reflected whatever our main, whatever our sort of like main anxieties about health are at the time. But then, of course, projected on a vulnerable population to better or bad ends.
Yeah, and I thought that one of your sort of conclusions that throughout these different decades, throughout the centuries, you see sort of time and again these experiments essentially being conducted with the country's most marginalized populations, and then often they are blamed for a failure to thrive. So, I think you highlight those connections really clearly through some of these examples, and how how much work we still have left to undo, right? Some of these legacies. And yeah, I mean, in particular, I was not as aware, but fascinated by your sort of tracing of the shift from sort of cities as the unhealthy places, suburbs being the healthier places, to then in the more recent decades, right, this kind of urban renaissance, and the suburbs being painted as a more unhealthy place, and the shift to more marginalized populations living in the suburbs, right? I think that is often something that we talk about at the museum in thinking about contemporary immigrant communities, is that the suburbs have a lot of immigrants living in them.
And and I think again, just to bring it back to a moment to new urbanism, right? When in Suburban Nation, where they're talking about the suburbs as being homogenous, right? And but the reality of a lot of suburbs, and again, not all suburbs, right? But the suburbs today in a lot of cities, I think, are a lot more diverse than we may be conceiving them as. And when we think about health, right, and we think about people that choose to live there. And what that means, we need to reconsider that history or reconsider that perception.
Yeah, absolutely, and try to push ourselves beyond the ideas about choice and about the sort of individual perspective. So we have a question actually that is relevant to what we've just been talking about. But do you think that the urban renewal programs of the mid-20th century, which we saw in some of those images there, do you think that these programs were kind of in sum total better or worse looking back, right? And within the context of health and wellness, like where do we think that those programs fall on the balance, and what lessons can we learn maybe from that time period of urban development?
Sure. I mean, I think the conclusion is urban renewal as a whole was a big disaster for the American, for especially Black and Brown communities, right, that were displaced, right, or had their neighborhoods removed completely. I think it was such a broad brush, right, that was taken, and it was not for health reasons that there was blight in these neighborhoods. It was racist policies, and it was decades of investment. It was a very, particular move to shift investment to the suburbs instead. And so I think, but why it's important to talk about, though, is not just because of those ill effects, but again, to see how accepted it was, the use of health. The use of health and sort of the threat of disease and how that was leveraged to remove those neighborhoods is something very important that we need to remember in contemporary planning practice. So, and I think actually, I think understandably now there's a lot of fear on the behalf of urban planners and designers because of the ruinous effects of urban blight to get involved in health issues again. What I try and conclude with, and actually, the whole reason I wrote the book, and I should add, I mean, I am an architect, I'm a licensed architect, I'm a landscape architect too, is why can't we learn from that though, and not sort of design in a bubble? And I think that was maybe the other error of urban planning, was to rationalize everything and to anonymize the people that lived in there, and just use the health metaphor as a reason to demolish these neighborhoods.
Yeah, so much so, right? You see really how the concerns about health are being used to justify racist urban planning practices.
Right.
And, I was just sort of struck there in your sort of identification of how care and maintenance plays into these conversations, and how the opposite of care, neglect, right? We see, right? It's like the reason that there is this blight is because of neglect, and that duality of neglect and care, I think, is something too you I saw sort of in your conclusion of like, how can we have a more holistic planning, practice that cares, right, and takes
Right.
care into account.
Right, and it goes beyond design. I think it's
Yeah.
the idea that planners and designers are involved in the projects far beyond the conclusion of a project, right?
Yeah.
And need to know about the maintenance, know about building operations as well. So,
Yeah.
so if that's a way that we can reframe practice around this idea of care, and I know it's a bit of a buzzword right now, but but I love that's entering in the conversation, and I think actually maybe I don't know if I use explicitly the word care, but somebody brought it up in an interview with me, and I use health. And I think, wellness, health, and care all mean different things. And if we understand that and understand what goals we're building towards, then that becomes really important.
Absolutely. And just being able to communicate and collaborate on what we mean with the people that are being impacted when we're talking about health or wellness. We have another question that's also related to where I wanted to go next, which is the present and future. But this viewer wants to know, what kind of housing or built environment experiments do you foresee happening next?
I mean, there's a lot of interesting experimentation that I hope continues, even though I think the pandemic is obviously going to dominate discourse and needs for the next several decades. I think what's really promising, though, is a lot of design experimentation that is pandemic resilient, is also climate resilient as well, and also addresses some of the chronic diseases that we're dealing with in the 21st century. In the book, towards the end, I try and highlight a housing development that was done in Seattle, in the High Point neighborhood of Seattle, that was done, with, again, I would say new urbanist ideas, but was done much more ground up, and with the input of the residents, with really nice gardens in between the houses. And what's fascinating is, and I think this is key for design and planning in the future, is they enlisted public health professionals to do what we call a post-occupancy analysis, and they actually tracked the residents, and not just sort of depending on the sidewalks and the architecture to do the work to increase walking, to increase interaction with the landscape, but also instituting programs, right? Like a walking program, where people would feel safe walking around. And so I think that's really fascinating. We hear a lot of talk right now about trees, that trees are going to save cities because, and trees are great. I love trees. But I also tried to highlight a program in the book from Lawrence, Massachusetts, that actually talks about it's actually, quite hard to plant trees in existing neighborhoods, and how you plant trees with community input, and also thinking about sort of targeted health concerns. And so I think, every few decades, and I would say, again, we're going to hear it again because it's the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted this year. So we're going to hear a lot about, and again, it comes up in New Urbanism Discord about, like, we knew how to build the old way of building. And I try and deconstruct that a little bit in the book, because yes, there are very good ideas that we can take forward. And there's some real foundational ideas that we've lost, I think, in the interim. But how do we apply it for sort of the more complicated urban context that we live in? And how do we do it with the cooperation of the people that live in these neighborhoods, and do something that's right for those neighborhoods as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And you really sort of make the case for kind of the need to reconnect these fields that have become quite disconnected, right? It's like in the 19th century, we saw actually public health and urban planning were working sort of in tandem to change the built environment. And now we see sort of fragmented and kind of isolated efforts, and this sort of movement that you highlight to, like, kind of bring these different pieces together. So how do we bring in public health professionals into the housing program, right? Into the architecture planning and so it's fascinating.
I was just going to say, and it's difficult to, I would say this as somebody in my job before this one, I had a joint appointment in the School of Architecture and the School of Public Health at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And it was a really, it was great because it was the subject of my dissertation, and then this job came up and somebody contacted for me. And, but it was difficult. I mean, it was actually, like, quite difficult to get both departments on board. And in fact, there was a lot of questioning from both departments of like, why is an architecture professor, teaching in a school of public health? And, the other way around, and, a lot of questions from the architecture community of like, what do you do in public health? And I actually taught a class that brought together public health students and architecture students. And a lot of it, is just figuring out sort of a shared language, shared priorities, and what skills they could take each other. And it was not easy. I mean, it took some time for both of those groups to understand each other. And so I think it's sort of a microcosm of the challenges we will face if we're going to try and reconnect these fields in a meaningful way in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The epidemiologists didn't want anything to do with me. I mean, they're great. They're colleagues, but they
right.
definitely did not. They did not understand the reasoning for the position. So.
Yeah, and I've had that personal experience that kind of exemplifies what you see sort of writ large.
Yeah.
I was glad that you mentioned, right, that you started this book pre-pandemic, since I think it's just so serendipitous that your book then came out in this period when globally people are thinking about public health. But sort of in considering the importance of your research for our current moment, has anything surprised you in sort of the different pandemic era responses that you've seen from planners and designers?
Yeah, I hope this is not too controversial. I would say the lack of action, maybe on the part of planners and designers. And I think also, and I kind of felt this way too. I mean, I think we all remember the sort of like hope we felt after the first round of vaccines came out. And I mean, I'm incredibly grateful to get mine, to have most of my family vaccinated. My two youngest kids are actually still too young to be vaccinated, so we're still following a lot of the same protocols we have been for the past 2 years. But one thing I did think is like, nobody's going to care about the environmental changes anymore, right? There was all this movement around like, we need to build more parks in cities, we need to consider housing. And while being incredibly grateful for how fast the vaccine was manufactured and distributed, I think what we see now are sort of like the limits of vaccine uptake and of individual choices. And so, I mean, I should not fault the professions for this. As I talk about in the book, it takes a long time for the built environment to reflect health concerns. But I think I am a little bit surprised that, probably the most immediate design changes we've seen have been on the behalf of restaurant workers, right? Grocery store workers, planners that have, done closed streets or something like that, or schools. And I mean, I think this is something, again, I'm very concerned with is, the ways that teachers had to retrofit their classrooms for air filters, right? Or finding opportunities for ventilation. So I think, unfortunately, it hasn't come from the architecture and planning communities yet. Maybe that hesitancy comes from this very sort of checkered history of health, or maybe this thinking that it is going to be solved by the vaccine. But I mean, I hope this is something we take into the future, because like I said, a lot of things that are that will, in design, that will make us more resilient to the pandemic, will have are beneficial if we think about the effects of climate change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of widening the way that we think about health. And I think you also very clearly make this call for people involved in whether it's landscape design or architects or public health professionals to sort of see health as an ethic, I think is the way you describe it, right? Rather than something that's a commodity or something that's a sort of nice to have. And the way that right at the beginning of the pandemic, we did see more of these like structural ideas popping up. And then, in the course of this have sort of come back to the way that within the US, so often health is framed as a, something that is not a right.
Right. And it's a result of individual choices. And not to fault the design and planning communities, and specifically, it's just sort of this overwhelming attitude that we have in the United States, that health is a result of the individual choices, or it's a result of morality. And of course, with the pandemic, it's breaking down all those perceptions. And I hope we come out of this, thinking about sort of our responsibility to each other. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have time for sort of one final question. I'm curious sort of what lesson you would sort of want to leave us with, like one takeaway from the book, which I know is always like the hardest question. I'm sorry, I'm ending with this, but
yeah.
Sort of the one takeaway that you would want us to bring with us.
I mean, I think we kind of hit it in these last questions as well. I mean, one is that health as an ethic, and it is to say, I mean, I think in both the American Planning Association, I know the American Institute of Architects, we talk about health, safety, and welfare, right, is a foundational ethic, but it's through so many factors that we often see health instead sort of like offer, and again, it's before these became a sort of part of the oath. I talk about in the book about people, being able to pay for nature resorts, right? Escaping to nature resorts and like literally consuming the landscape, but that this is only available to an elite class. And this, we see it throughout history that, and I try and define the difference between wellness, which is often something that is commodified, right, and can be purchased, is different from health, which is a sort of like foundational public health. So I think maybe going forward, what I would just say is there are many good ideas in the past, but let's not apply them uncritically, right? And let's think about what they really mean in the context that we are working in today, and how can we improve on those ideas as well.
Mm-hmm. Be constantly revisiting what we think we know about the past.
Yeah,
that's often something we think about at the museum in looking at what we have learned and how can we keep learning from these things that we think we know. So certainly, everyone watching this, please buy this book, Topography of Wellness. It's available through the Tenement Museum shop or your local book retailer. And Sarah, I think you said a new printing should be shipping soon.
So you'll see it's back ordered in some places, but it's subject to supply. Publishing is very subject to the supply chain issues right now, but I believe in most places it'll be back in stock at the end of the month or in the beginning of February.
Okay, good to know. And certainly I learned so much reading it, and I know, anyone would do the same. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is such a critical conversation to be having, and we really appreciate you taking time to share your ideas with us.
Thank you so much, Kat, and thank you to anybody tuning in tonight. Stay well, stay healthy, take care.
Okay, take care, everyone.